I've talked about why instructional analysis is important for instructional design. Now I'd like to explain the three types of instructional analysis. They are learner analysis, context analysis, and content analysis. You can see learner and context analysis help us understand the learning situations. Content analysis helps us break down the complicated instructional goals into smaller chunks of information and components, and also helps us understand how they relate to each other. I'll start from context analysis because in most cases it should be done first. Three factors need to be considered here: design context, learning context, and application context. Design context is about the constraints and parameters of the instructional design project itself. When getting started with an ID project, instructional designers would first want to know some very basic information about the project. For example, the timeline, the budget, the people who are involved in the project, etc. And then, instructional designers would like to gather more information about the learning environment where their final ID product will be implemented, or where the students learn. The characteristics of the learning environment may include locations, technology systems, the available tools, equipment, or materials. Finally, during context analysis, instructional designers need to consider when and how their learners apply the new knowledge and skills. This information helps us design strategies that support students to transfer what they've learned from the learning environment to the real-world situations. The second type of analysis is learner analysis. This type of analysis is to identify the characteristics of your audience. Here I'm listing some examples of student characteristics, such as age, gender, language and cultural backgrounds, previous experiences, as well as their physical or cognitive characteristics. The key in learner analysis is to identify the characteristics and differences among the learners that matter to teaching and learning. For example, students' age and language is important information for instructional designers because the way you teach a second grader who speaks English as a first language would probably be different than how you teach a fifth grader who's not very fluent with the English language. The goal of learner analysis is to create an overall picture of our learners so that we understand their needs. This helps us determine if the instructional goals and learning objectives are appropriate. Also, we'll identify their interest as related to the content. This helps us prepare specific topics, examples, or activities. Finally, we'll have better understanding of their overall readiness for the instruction so that we can determine their entry levels and adjust the complexity and depth of content, as well as select the appropriate strategies to facilitate their learning. The third type of analysis is often the most complicated and time-consuming one. It's called content analysis. As mentioned earlier, this type of analysis breaks down the instructional goals into smaller chunks of knowledge and skills and identify the relationships among these smaller components, depending on the specific instructional goals you have defined. Remember, the goals fall under different categories using either Garnet's categories or Bloom's taxonomy. Here I am listing the categories defined by Garnet. Depending on the categories of your instructional goals, There are at least 3 different ways to conduct content analysis: hierarchical analysis, cluster analysis, and procedural analysis. Hierarchical analysis is very common in content analysis because it focuses on intellectual skills and also learner attitudes. And most learning requires the development of intellectual skills. The product of hierarchical analysis is often a learning map. Here is an example from our textbook on page 55. As you can see, this learning map includes a hierarchical structure with multiple levels. Each level represents the foundational knowledge, prerequisite, and simpler skills students must develop before moving up to the next level of more complicated skills. The very bottom of this learning map usually indicates the entry level student must achieve at the beginning of instruction. The very top of the learning map is the instructional goal we'd like to achieve at the end of instruction. To conduct hierarchical analysis and create a learning map like this, we need to break down the instructional goals vertically and figure out the sequence for introducing new concepts and new skills. In contrast, cluster analysis is to examine the instructional goals horizontally to organize topics so that curriculum are divided into units or blocks that are more manageable. This type of analysis focuses on verbal information. You can see an example from page 55. In this example, the instructional goal is to remember the states and capitals of the United States. This is a verbal information goal because it only requires memorization and a simple recall of information. In this case, cluster analysis helps us combine information into groups and organize them in meaningful ways to make it easier to memorize. The third way to conduct content analysis is called procedural analysis. If you have an instructional goal that requires motor skills, such as dance, skating, or assembling equipment, procedural analysis helps us break down a complex movement into smaller steps and determine the sequence of these steps so that we can teach one at a time. You may feel this procedural analysis is quite similar to the hierarchical analysis explained earlier. They both break down a complex instructional goal into smaller pieces and determine how these small components relate to each other. The difference is that hierarchical analysis focuses on intellectual skills. It examines the mental process and breaks it down to smaller cognitive steps. Procedural analysis instead examines the physical activities, exercises, or movement and identify the small procedural steps that learners must follow in order to demonstrate the whole movement. Again, you can see an example on page 56 to view an example of procedural analysis. Now we've talked about the 3 different ways for conducting content analysis, depending on the specific instructional goals we have. As you probably noticed, in many situations, we need to combine the different approaches to analyze complex goals because they require learners to both follow a step-by-step procedure and progressively demonstrate the prerequisite skills for higher levels of intellectual skills. On page 57, The textbook shows an example of installing an app on an iPhone, which includes both the hierarchical analysis and the procedural analysis. So here, this is the hierarchical analysis, which identifies the prerequisite skills, and this flowchart shows the procedural analysis. Another example I can think of is to develop computer application programs. This learning goal requires intellectual skills that students have to master a series of prerequisite knowledge and skills in coding and computer systems. Additionally, this goal also requires the learners to follow the appropriate procedure. For example, creating the variables, setting the parameters, and then developing functions for the application program. To sum up, we've talked about 3 types of instructional analysis. Context analysis, which should be done first, is to gather the basic information about the instructional design project, the learning environment, and the application context. Learner analysis is to help us understand our audience so that we can plan and develop instruction that are appropriate for their needs, their interest, and their readiness levels. Content analysis is often the most complicated one. For goals requiring intellectual skills, we use hierarchical analysis to break down the instructional goals into smaller pieces so that we understand the different levels of prerequisite knowledge and skills. For goals focusing on verbal information, we conduct cluster analysis to divide curriculum content into more manageable units and blocks. For motor skills, we examine the procedural steps that need to be followed to complete the whole movement. We also learned that in many situations, due to the complexity of the instructional goals, we'll have to combine the different methods when conducting content analysis.